The rain lashed against the ancient windows of Ravenscroft Manor when a scream tore through the darkness. Someone was dead, or perhaps someone was about to die. But the real question was, who was the killer? Sir Edmund Sinclair's final painting was not just a masterpiece, it was a secret. A secret that was never meant to be revealed. But now that secret was coming to light, and whoever dared to uncover it would have to gamble with their own life. Do you truly wish to know the truth? Can you survive until the very end? It was a night that should have passed in the quiet monotony St. Mary's was accustomed to, where the clipped hedgerows and orderly lives of its inhabitants rarely strayed into the realm of the extraordinary. But this night would not be so fortunate. The first whisper of unease came just after 9, a flicker of movement on the narrow lane leading to Sinclair House. Lights, hesitant at first, blinked awake behind lace-curtained windows as the murmurs spread, an unformed fear creeping into the stillness. A name soon took shape among the hushed voices: Sir Edmund Sinclair, the artist, the recluse, a man whose genius had kept him both present and absent in the village, a mind lost within his own labyrinthine creations. And now he was dead. Constable Thomas Burrows was the first to step into the studio. A pragmatic man, he had dealt with his share of village disturbances, missing livestock, drunken brawls, the occasional petty theft, but nothing that prepared him for this. His boots crunched over broken glass as he moved cautiously into the dimly lit room, candlelight flickering across the chaos. Canvases stood like silent witnesses, their unfinished visions staring back at him from the walls, and in the center of the disarray, sprawled upon the paint-streaked floor, lay Sir Edmund, his head twisted at a grotesque angle, shattered spectacles beside him, the dark bloom of blood pooling beneath him like spilled ink on a masterpiece left incomplete. Burrows exhaled slowly. Something about the scene gnawed at him: the overturned chair, the scattered brushes, the splintered vase near the window. At first glance it spoke of a struggle, a burglary perhaps. But then, why had nothing been taken? The expensive palettes and fine brushes remained untouched. The paintings jostled but not stolen. And then there was the easel, the unfinished canvas standing ominously against the far wall, the strokes bold and frenzied, unlike Sinclair's usual meticulous hand, almost as if the artist had faltered in his final moments. Burrows felt an inexplicable unease as he looked at it, the paint still glistening wet beneath the candlelight, as though the artwork itself had witnessed something unspeakable. A rustle at the doorway pulled him from his thoughts. A figure stood there, hesitant, one of Sinclair's house staff, pale and trembling. "Best get Inspector Davis," Burrows muttered. The lad gave a quick nod before vanishing into the night. The air inside was thick with the mingling scents of oil paint and something metallic: blood, death. How strange, Burrows thought, that a space devoted to creation had become the stage for such destruction. Moments later, Inspector Davis arrived. A man of weary patience, long resigned to the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. His sharp eyes swept the scene before him. "Burglary gone wrong," he mused, voice calm but probing. Burrows hesitated. "Perhaps, sir, but," he gestured to the room, "something doesn't sit right." Davis sighed, peeling off his gloves. "It never does," he murmured. "And yet people insist on making it so." A silence followed, broken only by the steady ticking of a clock on the mantel. And then from the hallway, a voice soft yet resolute, perhaps, came the measured observation: "That is because this is not a burglary at all." Both men turned. In the doorway, clad in her ever-practical tweed coat, stood Miss Agatha Marple. Her expression was thoughtful, her keen blue eyes absorbing every detail with the quiet intelligence of someone who saw what others missed. "How fortunate," she continued, stepping lightly into the room, "that I happened to be passing by." And so it began. The night air pulsed with whispers, threading through the village like an unspoken current. From the narrow lanes of St. Mary's to the warm shadowed corners of the Rose and Thorn Inn, Sir Edmund Sinclair's name slipped from lip to lip, a scandalous melody wrapped in intrigue. The village had known tragedy before, the respectable sort, an elderly woman lost to illness, a farmhand taken by the river's current. But murder, that was something else entirely. And now Sinclair House, with its ivy-clad facade and darkened windows, loomed over the village like a spectre, its secrets waiting to be unraveled. Inspector Wallace Crowley had seen many crime scenes in his career, but nothing quite like this. The air inside the old chapel-turned-studio was thick with the scent of oil paint and something far more sinister, something metallic, something final. The broken window let in the cold night air, making the candle flames flicker ominously. Jonathan Graves, the famed but reclusive artist, lay sprawled on the wooden floor, his body twisted in an unnatural position, his face frozen in an expression of sheer horror. It was as if he had seen something before his death, something that had shattered his very soul. Constable Harold Finch, his young and eager subordinate, swallowed hard as he took in the scene. The room was a chaotic mess of canvases, paint-stained rags, and overturned furniture. But amidst the disorder, one thing stood out, a half-finished painting, still mounted on its easel. The brush was still in Jonathan's lifeless fingers, as though he had been painting even in his final moments. The image on the canvas was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. It depicted a figure, its face only partially completed, yet even in its unfinished state, the eyes seemed to follow them around the room, cold and calculating. "What do you make of this, sir?" Finch finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Crowley didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to the painting, his experienced eyes analyzing every brushstroke. The colors were bold yet erratic, as if painted in a frenzy. The unfinished face, it was familiar. He could sense it, but the identity refused to surface in his mind. "Look at his hand," Crowley said suddenly, pointing toward the corpse. Finch crouched beside the body, his hesitation evident. He carefully pried open Jonathan's stiff fingers and retrieved a crumpled piece of paper. The ink was smudged, but the words were still legible. It must be finished before the unveiling. No more mistakes. The unveiling? Finch frowned. Isn't the town festival in 2 days? Could this be related? Perhaps. Crowley's voice was distant, his mind already racing through possibilities. Or perhaps the unveiling was something far more personal, something Graves was desperate to complete before someone stopped him. Outside, the town of Blackwood Hollow was already abuzz with speculation. Mrs. Lydia Harper, the self-proclaimed gatekeeper of town gossip, stood at the chapel gates, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Beside her, Mr. Curtis, the postmaster, leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper. "They say the window was broken clean through. Whoever did it must have been after something valuable." Mrs. Pettigrew, a frail, nervous-looking woman, sniffed disapprovingly. "Poets and painters, always tangled in some kind of trouble. My cousin in Brighton took up with a sculptor and lost all sense of herself, sold her best silver just to keep up with the madness." "Valuable," Mrs. Harper scoffed. "A painting, perhaps, or something more sinister." A new voice interrupted them, calm but firm. "Not particularly," came the mild observation from behind. The group turned in unison, startled to find Miss Eleanor Hartley standing a few paces away. The novelist had been observing them in silence, her sharp blue eyes carrying the weight of someone who listened far more than she spoke. "Miss Hartley," Mrs. Harper recovered quickly, smoothing down her dress. "You do have a habit of appearing at the most curious moments." Eleanor gave a small knowing smile. "One must always pay attention to curious moments. They so often contain useful details." Mrs. Pettigrew leaned in eagerly. "You don't suppose it's true what they say, that Jonathan Graves was involved in some secret society? The Midnight Order," Mr. Curtis added dramatically, Or was it the Society of the Three Crowns? Utter nonsense, Mrs. Harper huffed. A man like Graves didn't need secret handshakes to get into trouble. He did just fine on his own. Inside the studio, Crowley let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple as the weight of the mystery settled upon him. It doesn't add up, Finch. If it was a burglary, why leave the silver untouched? And these drawings, he gestured to the scattered papers bearing strange sketches. Some were abstract, others eerily specific. One depicted a man in a top hat with an unnerving grin. Another was a complex series of interlocking triangles, almost like a puzzle, but the third was the unfinished portrait. Who was he painting? Finch asked, his voice hushed as though speaking too loudly might disturb the lingering presence in the room. From the hallway came the soft click of a heel against the floorboards. Both men turned as Eleanor Hartley stepped inside, the serene composure of a woman arriving for tea, despite the grim scene before her. "Inspector," she greeted mildly, already scanning the room. "What a terrible thing, quite unsettling, isn't it?" Crowley, who had long ago learned that Miss Hartley's presence was never incidental, sighed. Indeed. She stepped forward, her gaze landing on the half-finished painting. Her expression barely changed, but Crowley caught the flicker of something recognition. "You've seen this before," he stated rather than asked. Eleanor hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering. "Not this exactly, but something like it." A chill ran down Finch's spine. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head, considering the question. Then, with a voice as steady as a ticking clock, she said, "I believe Jonathan Graves was painting someone he knew, someone he feared, and someone who might not have wanted to be revealed." A heavy silence fell over the room. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and in that moment, the unfinished face on the canvas seemed almost alive. Crowley exhaled sharply. "This wasn't just murder," he murmured. "This was a message, but from whom? And why?" Outside, the townsfolk whispered and speculated. Inside, the mystery of Jonathan Graves' final painting had only just begun. The heavy air of the dimly lit chamber carried the scent of aged parchment, turpentine, and something far more elusive, regret. Eleanor Hartley moved lightly toward the grand mahogany desk, her gloved fingers trailing over its polished surface as she peered at the cryptic sketches scattered across it. Some were rough, hurried, half-formed faces with hollow eyes. Others bore a meticulous precision, each line etched with an obsessive, almost desperate intent. She murmured almost to herself, "It is a peculiar thing, isn't it, that which unsettles us most is often what, upon closer examination, makes the most sense." Inspector Wallace Crowley, standing a few feet away, regarded her wearily. "You already have a theory, Miss Hartley." A small knowing smile played at her lips. "Goodness, no, Inspector. One must never rush to conclusions." She tapped a gloved finger against her chin, eyes narrowing as she studied the scattered papers. "But I do believe," she paused, considering, then added, "I should very much like to speak with Miss Vivian Harrow." Crowley frowned. Vivian Harrow, the late Mr. Alden's muse. Miss Hartley nodded slowly. "It occurs to me that inspiration can be a rather dangerous thing." Her gaze drifted toward an unfinished portrait, resting on an easel near the corner of the study, its painted eyes shadowed in mystery. "And love," she added, her voice barely above a whisper, even more so. With that she turned gracefully toward the door, leaving behind an inspector who had the distinct weary feeling that she had already begun to unravel his case before he had even formulated the right questions. It was a strange thing, Eleanor Hartley thought, as she stepped out into the cold night air, how grief wore so many different faces. Some bore it like an open wound, raw and exposed. Others concealed it beneath layers of composure, an intricate performance of dignity. And then there were those like Vivian Harrow, who carried it like a whisper, barely spoken yet heavy as stone. Vivian sat in the dimly lit parlor of Blackthorn House, poised like a woman trapped between memory and reality. The grand estate spoke in hushed tones of its former master, Mr. Alden's presence lingered in every forgotten detail. A cold fireplace, its embers long extinguished, a half-finished cup of tea on a side table, its contents curdled into something unrecognizable. A stack of old sketchbooks, their pages curling with time, and above the mantel one of the few portraits he had ever chosen to keep, a woman's face, painted with such haunting depth that it seemed almost alive. The strokes were bold yet delicate, each layer of color whispering a secret of its own. Miss Hartley, standing near the doorway, observed the woman before her with quiet curiosity. Vivian's eyes, framed by dark lashes, lingered on the portrait a moment too long before shifting toward her visitor. "I suppose you've come to ask about him," she said, her voice smooth but distant. Miss Hartley offered a polite, measured nod. "A terrible thing, his passing. It must have been quite the shock." Vivian exhaled, tilting her chin slightly, a movement that balanced precariously between composure and restraint. "I don't think it's fully settled in yet," she admitted. "I still expect to hear his voice calling for me, asking where he's left his spectacles." A faint ghostly smile touched her lips, but it did not reach her eyes. Miss Hartley's keen gaze did not miss the subtle weight behind those words. "You knew him well then?" Vivian's fingers traced an absent pattern along the edge of the chair's armrest. "As well as anyone could, I suppose. Alden was singular, impossible at times, but brilliant. Art consumed him. It was the only thing that truly mattered. The only thing." Miss Hartley's voice was gentle, yet the words landed like a carefully placed stone in still water. Vivian's fingers stilled. For the briefest of moments her expression flickered, an imperceptible crack in the porcelain mask of grief. It was a moment quickly mended, but not before Miss Hartley had tucked the observation neatly into the folds of her mind. "I mean only that he was dedicated to his work," Vivian corrected smoothly, her hands moving with unnecessary precision to smooth the fabric of her dress. "His greatest love." Miss Hartley tilted her head ever so slightly. "Men of genius often are, aren't they? Passionate about their craft, to the exclusion of all else. It must have been difficult, at times being his muse." Vivian let out a soft, breathy laugh, one that carried no real humor. Muse. The word sat on her tongue, as though it had lost its meaning. "That's what they called me, as if I were some ethereal thing, conjured solely for his inspiration. Weren't you?" The question was delicate, yet its impact was undeniable. Vivian's eyes darkened, her grip tightening ever so slightly on the chair's edge. "I was more than that," she said, her voice quiet but edged with something brittle. "I mattered to him. I wasn't just inspiration, I was part of his life." Miss Hartley inclined her head, watching as Vivian turned away, her gaze drawn once more to the portrait above the mantel. There was sorrow in her expression, yes, but something else too, something quieter, something that to the untrained eye might have been mistaken for grief alone. Miss Hartley, however, was very well trained. Inspector Hawthorne watched as Eleanor Whitmore sat composed in the dim glow of the parlor, her gloved fingers absently tracing the rim of a delicate porcelain teacup. The storm outside lashed against the windows of Ashcombe Manor, rain streaming down the glass in frantic rivulets, distorting the world beyond like an unfinished watercolor. Within these walls, where the late Benedict Fairfax had once roamed, a different kind of storm brewed, one of unanswered questions and the lingering spectre of unfinished intentions. The air, thick with linseed oil and the faint ghost of turpentine, carried an unspoken weight, as though the very house itself mourned its master's demise. A half-burned candle flickered beside a sheaf of crumpled sketches, each depicting the same woman in various states of sorrow. Some rendered her with longing, others with an almost painful devotion, but one, a final unfinished portrait, stood apart. It had been abandoned at the easel, its bold strokes betraying a restless hand, a mind haunted by something unspoken. Hawthorne allowed his gaze to settle on the artwork before shifting it back to the woman who had, in some manner, inspired it. Memories, Eleanor murmured, almost to herself, as though caught in a distant reverie. They're such strange things, aren't they? So pliable, so eager to comfort us with lies. She smiled then, but it was a smile that did not reach her eyes. It was something practiced, something measured. Hawthorne merely tightened his jaw. "You knew him well, Miss Whitmore?" he asked, his voice careful, even. Eleanor exhaled slowly, the candlelight casting long shadows along the delicate line of her jaw. "Well enough," she said, "or perhaps only as well as he allowed anyone to." Her fingers, which had moved idly against the china, now stilled, betraying a flicker of hesitation before she set the teacup down with the softest clink. Outside, the wind howled through the gaps beneath the door, curling through the room like a whisper of something unseen. "It must have been difficult," Hawthorne continued, his gaze unwavering. Being his muse, Eleanor let out a soft laugh, light, effortless, yet devoid of warmth. "Muse," she echoed, tilting her head slightly, as though rolling the word around in her mind for the first time. "That's what they called me, wasn't it? As if inspiration is some passive thing, a creature summoned at a whim." Her eyes darkened, the flickering candlelight revealing something sharper beneath the polished veneer of her expression. "But it wasn't like that. I wasn't like that." Hawthorne studied her, watching the way she held herself, how carefully she measured each word, each pause, each glance. And yet, he mused, Sir Benedict was found lifeless in his studio, his masterpiece left unfinished, his final subject haunting his canvas like a spectre. Eleanor's gaze flickered toward the portrait above the fireplace, where the brush strokes were bold, desperate, yearning. A man's final devotion immortalized in oil and pigment. "His greatest work," she whispered, almost reverently. But there was something else laced in her tone, something indistinct, something unreadable, regret, triumph. The inspector leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore," he said, voice low, deliberate, "did you love him, or did you simply wish to keep him?" The words hung between them like the blade of a guillotine, suspended, waiting. For the first time that evening, Eleanor Whitmore hesitated. It was a peculiar thing, Hawthorne thought, how grief wore so many masks. Some carried it like a burden, heavy upon their shoulders. Others, he glanced at Eleanor, wore it like a veil, something to be adjusted, reshaped, concealed. And beneath it all, there was always something more. The village of Blackthorn Hollow had always been a place of quiet whispers and veiled glances, but tonight, under the watchful glow of the gas lamps, it was alive with a restless energy that sent ripples through its cobbled streets. The annual harvest gala, long anticipated for its charm and spectacle, had taken on a far more sinister air, for this year, it was not only a celebration, it was a reckoning. The recent death of Elias Radcliffe, the reclusive yet revered historian, whose work had unearthed long-buried secrets of the town's past, hung over the event like a spectre. And at the center of it all, standing in the great hall beneath a magnificent crystal chandelier, was Isabel Fairfax, the woman who had been closest to the departed man in life, and was now the subject of whispered speculation in his death. A hush settled as the great red velvet curtain was drawn back, revealing the final piece Elias had been working on before his untimely demise. A tapestry, unlike anything Blackthorn Hollow had ever seen, stood stretched across the grand stage, its intricate embroidery capturing scenes both mesmerizing and chilling. Townsfolk craned their necks, eyes wide, breaths caught in their throats. At first, it seemed a simple depiction of the village's founding, but then the details emerged. Figures with eyes too knowing, hands grasping at something unseen, expressions that suggested something just beneath the surface, something the town had perhaps chosen to forget. From the back of the room, Inspector Alden Thorne observed with quiet intensity, his sharp gaze moving not to the tapestry, but to the reactions in the crowd. A gasp from the mayor's wife, a quiet murmur between two aging scholars, A sharp intake of breath from young Lillian Price, the librarian's daughter, each response a thread in a tangled web. And then there was Isabel, standing still as stone, her fingers tightening around the lace of her sleeve. "Strange, isn't it?" she murmured, almost to herself. "How the past refuses to stay buried." Thorne turned slightly, his expression unreadable. "You seem unsettled, Miss Fairfax." She let out a breath of laughter, though there was no humor in it. "Wouldn't you be, Inspector? When a man spends his life chasing ghosts, is it any surprise when they finally catch up to him?" There was something brittle in the way she said it, something laced with desperation. Thorne made a note of that. People who loved carried sorrow, but people who needed to be loved carried something far more dangerous: fear. The fear of being forgotten, the fear of being left behind, the fear that despite all their efforts, they were never truly seen. The murmurs in the hall grew louder. "You must admit," came a hushed voice, belonging to none other than Harriet Weatherby, the town's most diligent purveyor of gossip, "it's rather ghastly, displaying a dead man's work like this. What if he never intended for it to be seen?" "Or worse," interjected Martin Holloway, the village's aging solicitor, "what if someone else didn't want it to be seen?" The weight of his words lingered, thick as the autumn air pressing against the great stained glass windows. The tapestry told a story, but whose story? And why had Elias Radcliffe paid for it with his life? The inspector's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sharp sound, the distant chime of the church bell, a reminder that time was pressing forward, whether they were ready or not. He cast another glance toward Isabel, whose eyes remained locked on the tapestry, her face unreadable. The night was far from over. In Blackthorn Hollow, secrets never remained buried for long. The town of Ashwick had long been a place of tradition and quiet routine, but today, as the clock struck noon, an air of unease lingered over its cobbled streets. The annual autumn gala, meant to be a celebration of art and culture, had become something else entirely, a spectacle draped in whispers of death and deception. At the heart of it all stood the enigmatic figure of Eleanor Graves, a woman known for her keen eye and sharper intuition, seated at her usual corner table in the Gilded Lily tea room. She stirred her tea absent-mindedly, her gaze flickering across the room as snippets of hushed conversations wove a tapestry of tension. The murder of Benedict Aldridge, the reclusive yet brilliant historian, whose work had unearthed long-buried truths, had cast a shadow over the festivities. The unveiling of his final manuscript, a piece he had been working on obsessively before his sudden demise, was set to take place that evening, but someone, it seemed, was desperate to keep those secrets buried. It was then that the note arrived, silent, unassuming, yet weighted with an unspoken urgency. Left upon her table when she had momentarily turned away, tucked neatly beneath the porcelain sugar bowl, Eleanor unfolded the slip of parchment, her expression impassive as she read the words in their hurried scrawl. "Another will fall before the unveiling. A second accident, unless you stop it tonight." Her grip tightened ever so slightly, though outwardly, she remained unchanged, merely setting the note aside with practiced indifference. Warnings such as these often carried a hint of melodrama, yet they were not to be ignored, not when blood had already been spilled. Across the tea room, Lydia Bancroft and Margaret Holloway, two of Ashwick's most dedicated gossips, were deep in hushed conversation. Their eyes darted toward the window, their voices hushed but urgent. "He was seen leaving the estate late last night," whispered Lydia, adjusting the lace cuff of her sleeve. "And this morning, not a trace of him." Margaret pressed her gloved hands together. "You don't mean—" "I mean exactly that. Theo Winthrop has vanished." Now that was interesting. Theo Winthrop, an artist of modest skill but considerable ambition, had been one of the few people with direct access to Benedict Aldridge in his final days. If someone wished to silence a loose end before the grand unveiling, he would be an obvious target. Eleanor slipped the note into her handbag, already piecing together the puzzle in her mind. There was work to be done. By mid-afternoon, the town square had transformed into a scene of barely contained chaos. Carpenters hammered last-minute adjustments to the grand stage where the manuscript would be revealed. Vendors arranged their displays with forced cheerfulness, while clusters of artists debated fiercely over whose work would attract the most attention. Yet beneath the hum of activity, there was an undercurrent of tension, an unspoken certainty that something was coming. Eleanor moved through the crowd, her presence inconspicuous yet ever watchful. She found Theo's makeshift gallery in a side room of the town hall, a collection of uninspired landscapes that betrayed no particular genius, only an eagerness to sell, but Theo himself was nowhere to be seen. A quick inquiry with the event's curator revealed what she had suspected. Theo had not been seen since the previous night. His absence was unsettling, and the implications even more so. Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the large covered easel at the center of the hall, beneath which lay Benedict Aldridge's final manuscript, waiting to be revealed. If someone had killed once to keep its secrets hidden, they would not hesitate to kill again. As dusk settled, the town of Ashwick braced itself for the event. Beneath the flickering glow of the gas lamps, anticipation thickened like a storm cloud on the horizon. Eleanor returned to her writing desk, reviewing the pieces laid before her. Benedict Aldridge was dead, Theo Winthrop was missing, and somewhere among the hushed whispers and polite smiles, a murderer was waiting, watching, ready to strike once more. The estate of Evermere Hall had stood for centuries, its grand halls echoing with the whispers of secrets long buried beneath its stone foundations. Tonight, however, it was not time that weighed heavily on its walls, but something far more immediate, something dangerous. The annual unveiling at the Evermere Art Gala was meant to be a celebration, yet an uneasy hush had settled over the preparations. The final painting of Alexander Redgrave, a masterpiece he had left unfinished before his untimely death, was set to be revealed. But in the days leading up to the event, strange occurrences had sent ripples through the quiet town of Ravenshire. First, the disappearance of art curator Desmond Halliday, a man known for his meticulous record-keeping, and now an anonymous note delivered with eerie precision to Eleanor Blackwood's private table at the Scarlet Finch Tea House. The note, left beneath the porcelain sugar dish, while her attention had been momentarily diverted, read in a jagged hand, "Another will fall before the unveiling. A second accident, unless you stop it tonight." Eleanor, a woman accustomed to studying the subtle currents of deception, let her fingers rest lightly on the paper, expression unchanged. Warnings such as these had a way of carrying melodrama, yet they were not to be dismissed. Across the tea room, the hushed voices of two socialites, Vivian Hargrove and Margaret Ellison, wove an undercurrent of tension. "He was seen near the Redgrave estate last night," Vivian whispered, her gaze darting toward the window. "And now, no one knows where he is." Margaret's voice was lower, wary. "Do you think it's true, that the painting holds some kind of hidden message?" A flash of intrigue passed through Eleanor's sharp eyes. The painting, of course, every mystery had a focal point, and here it was, the unfinished work of a man who had died under suspicious circumstances. If Alexander Redgrave's final piece held a secret worth killing for, then time was running short. By late afternoon, the Ravenshire Gallery was a storm of last-minute preparations. The main exhibition hall was filled with the murmur of artists, collectors, and patrons, but beneath the usual pleasantries, a subtle nervousness simmered. Eleanor moved through the crowd, her gaze sharp yet unreadable. She had been expecting to find Desmond Halliday, but in his place was Benedict Travers, the estate's solicitor, whose normally impeccable demeanor was marred by visible strain. His waistcoat, usually crisply pressed, was slightly askew, his fingers twitching as he arranged the placards near the covered easel that housed Redgrave's final work. "Miss Blackwood," he greeted stiffly, startled by her sudden presence. "Mr. Travers," she replied smoothly. Strange, isn't it, how people seem to vanish at the most inconvenient times? A muscle in his jaw tensed. I'm sure Desmond simply left without a word. A man so meticulous that he kept records of every interaction. I find that unlikely. She let the silence hang for a beat. Tell me, Mr. Travers, have you noticed anything unusual? His hand wavered ever so slightly as he reached for his pocket watch. Unusual, he echoed, forcing a laugh. Only that everyone is treating this painting as though it's the bloody Rosetta Stone. Perhaps it is, Eleanor mused. Secrets have a way of surfacing in the most unexpected places. His gaze flickered, briefly, but enough for her to notice. And then it shifted toward the covered easel. Eleanor followed his line of sight, the weight of understanding settling like a stone in her stomach. Whatever was hidden within Redgrave's final strokes, someone was willing to kill to keep it silent. As evening approached, anticipation crackled in the air like an oncoming storm. The glow of lanterns bathed the gallery in flickering light, casting long shadows against the gilded frames lining the walls. Eleanor returned to her study, piecing together the fragments laid before her. Redgrave was dead. Halliday was missing. And before the night was over, another secret, perhaps another life would be lost, unless she got there first. The hour was late, and the estate of Ashford Hollow stood silent beneath the weight of a restless night, its once grand facade bathed in the cold silver of moonlight. Inside, in the dim flickering glow of a single oil lamp, Eleanor Harcourt sat stiffly in the high-backed chair of the study, her fingers tracing the frayed edge of an unopened letter. Across from her, James Whitmore, the late Sebastian Ashford's most trusted friend and excellent, regarded her with an expression as carefully measured as his words. The silence between them stretched long and taut, settling into the room like dust in the untouched corners of forgotten things. I had not expected company this evening, Eleanor said at last, her voice smooth but hollow. Particularly not from you. James gave a wry smile, though there was no warmth in it. Nor had I intended to call, but I found myself with questions, Miss Harcourt, unanswered ones. Eleanor exhaled, her fingers tightening slightly around the parchment. Then I hope you are not expecting easy answers. The study smelled of old books and something else, something faint, metallic, like the lingering scent of a memory she could not yet place. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting restless shadows along the walls, the kind that made one feel as though they were being watched even when alone. James leaned forward, his gaze steady. Sebastian's death was called an accident, he said. And yet something tells me you don't believe that. Eleanor lifted her chin slightly, but she did not deny it. And what is it exactly that you think I know? She asked. James did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew something small, something folded and worn at the edges. He placed it on the table between them, a torn scrap of canvas, the paint smudged and unfinished. Even in the dim light, Eleanor could make out the unmistakable symbols etched upon it, a dagger, an eye, and a key, each enclosed within interlocking circles. She inhaled sharply. So you've seen it. James studied her reaction, the flicker of recognition she had not managed to hide. You knew about this. Eleanor hesitated, the weight of the secret pressing against her ribs like an iron cage. I knew Sebastian was working on something, she admitted, her voice quieter now. Something that troubled him. He said it would be his greatest masterpiece, but I think he feared what it would reveal. James's expression darkened. Then tell me, Eleanor, what was he trying to expose? She stood suddenly, crossing the room with restless energy, her silk gown whispering against the floorboards. You assume I have all the answers, she said, her voice sharp. But the truth is, I only have pieces. Sebastian spoke in riddles, in half-truths disguised as art. He told me once that power is never clean, and that the hands that funded his work were stained with something far worse than ink. James watched her carefully. And yet you were at the estate the night he died. She froze, her breath catching. What? I have proof, James said evenly. A smudge of oil paint on your gloves. A strand of hair caught on the unfinished frame. You went to see him, Eleanor, and I need to know why. Eleanor swallowed, the weight of the night pressing heavily upon her. I wanted the truth, she whispered, but I was too late. James exhaled slowly, leaning back as if considering her words. Then we are not the only ones seeking it. His gaze flickered toward the folded letter in her hand. That arrived this morning, didn't it? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Without another word, she unfolded the parchment, the inked words jagged and precise, written by an unseen hand. The unveiling will change everything, but only if you live to see it. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass as though something unseen pressed against it, waiting. James met her gaze, his voice low. Whatever Sebastian was trying to reveal, someone killed him to keep it hidden, and if that letter is any warning, they are not finished yet. Eleanor whispered. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting restless flickering shadows, as outside in the night, the secrets of Ashford Hollow stirred once more. The storm had settled into an uneasy hush, the kind of silence that clung to the air like an omen, thick with the weight of something unseen. The night pressed heavily against the windows of Eleanor Vale's study, the candlelight flickering as if in response to the restless unease in the air. The entire room was a shrine to the mystery that had consumed her thoughts for days. Scattered notes, sketches, and newspaper clippings pinned in a chaotic yet purposeful arrangement. Threads of red twine stretched between them, connecting seemingly unrelated fragments into a web of secrets, deception, and most of all danger. And at the very heart of it all, the obsidian portrait, Adrian Blackwood's final masterpiece, a painting that had not only cost the artist his life, but now threatened to claim more. Eleanor's fingers traced the edges of a single letter resting atop her desk, its ink still fresh, its message simple, yet chilling. The unveiling will not happen. Leave it alone. The weight of it pressed into her chest, not with fear, but with the undeniable certainty that this was far from over. Outside, the village was alive with the final preparations for the grand festival, where the painting was set to be unveiled in mere hours. People would gather in eager anticipation, unaware that beneath the gilded spectacle, a shadow lingered, waiting for the right moment to strike. Eleanor knew better. This was not just about art. It was about something far darker, something worth killing for. She did not look up as the clock on the mantelpiece struck the hour, its chime sharp and deliberate, each note reverberating through the dimly lit room like the ticking of an unseen countdown. Time was slipping away. Across the village square, laughter and music drifted on the wind, a deceptive contrast to the tension thrumming in Eleanor's veins. The fire crackled, throwing fleeting distorted shadows onto the walls as she reached for the telephone, her voice steady despite the weight pressing against her ribs. Inspector Harrow, I believe we have a problem. A pause on the other end. Then the familiar measured voice of a man who had long since learned to temper his emotions. Another note. Eleanor's grip on the receiver tightened, and a break-in. Her gaze flicked toward the fireplace, where the remnants of a charred photograph smoldered, its edges curling inward, blackened and ruined. Someone was in my study an hour ago. They left no trace, no sign of forced entry, except for this. Harrow's silence stretched, filled only by the soft crackling of the fire. And what exactly was in the photograph? Eleanor inhaled slowly. A copy of the painting. There was no immediate response, but when Harrow spoke again, his tone was grim. They don't just want the painting hidden, they want it erased. The weight of his words settled over her like a shroud. Whoever had killed Blackwood had done so for a reason, and whatever secret the painting held, they were willing to kill again to keep it buried. You still plan to go through with it? Harrow asked, his voice low. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. Of course. Another pause. Then with quiet resolve he said, then we need to be prepared. Whoever we're dealing with, they won't hesitate this time. The line went dead. Eleanor set the receiver down with deliberate care, her mind already racing ahead. If the painting held the answers, if it revealed something worth killing for, then tonight would be their last chance to unmask the truth before it was buried forever. The unveiling wasn't just an exhibition anymore, it was a trap, and she could only hope the killer would walk straight into it. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, rattling the windows and stirring leaves into restless spirals. Somewhere in the distance, the festival bells rang, their echo threading through the dark like the opening notes of a requiem. The game had begun, and this time the killer would not slip away unseen. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Ashcombe Hollow, rattling old shop signs and sweeping leaves into restless spirals. The village square, usually a place of quaint charm and idle gossip, was now thick with tension, a nervous energy crackling beneath the gaslight's flickering glow. The festival was only hours away, and yet something unseen prowled beneath the surface, a shadow lingering just beyond the reach of sight. At the heart of it all was The Raven's Lament, a painting by the late Victor Whitmore, an artist whose sudden and violent demise had left behind far more questions than answers. The unveiling was meant to be a celebration of his final masterpiece, yet now it had become something far more dangerous. Eleanor Wren stood at the edge of the square, her gloved hands resting lightly on the handle of her handbag. She had been expecting this, the unease, the whispers, the way the villagers threw anxious glances toward the festival hall, as though afraid of what might be revealed. She had spent days piecing together fragments of a puzzle, old letters, half-burnt sketches, the testimony of those who had known Victor best. And now it was all coming to a head. A sudden commotion near the east wing of the exhibition hall caught her attention. A shrill gasp, the hurried shuffle of feet, and then a voice high-pitched with panic. "Someone's hurt, please. Someone get help." Eleanor moved quickly, her mind already racing ahead of her steps. She pushed through the gathering crowd, past startled faces and murmured speculations, until she reached the source of the disturbance. There, leaning against the stone steps, was Martin Holloway, the nervous curator of the exhibit. His usually composed appearance was in disarray, his coat dusted with dirt, his tie askew, his face drained of color. Inspector Rowan was already there, his sharp gaze scanning the scene with the cool detachment of a man who had seen far too much. "Mr. Holloway claims someone pushed him," he said without preamble, his voice low. Eleanor studied the curator carefully, his hands trembled as he wiped them against his coat, his breath still uneven. "I was checking the security of the painting," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the hall. "I heard something behind me, turned, and then I was falling." She glanced toward the steps. The fall wouldn't have killed him, but it could have left him unconscious, vulnerable. Someone was growing desperate. Rowan's expression darkened. "They don't want that painting seen." Eleanor nodded slowly, "and they're running out of patience." The weight of it pressed against them both, the realization that they were playing a game with an opponent who had already shown their willingness to kill. "Do you still intend to go through with the unveiling?" Rowan asked. Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile, though there was no humor in it. "Oh, I do." Another pause, then Rowan sighed, resigned. "Then we set a trap." Lightning flashed overhead, momentarily illuminating the festival hall's grand entrance. The storm was building, and with it the final act of a mystery that had waited too long for its reckoning. The grand drawing room of Ashwood Manor was a vast, oppressive space, its towering bookshelves and heavy drapes swallowing the firelight, casting restless shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Rain lashed at the windows in feverish bursts, rattling the panes as if desperate to be let inside. At the heart of the room, Evelyn Blackwood stood stiffly by the unlit fireplace, her silhouette dark against the cold marble. She did not turn as the door creaked open, nor did she acknowledge the figures who stepped inside, though her fingers curled ever so slightly against the stone mantel, betraying the storm within. "Evelyn," Jonathan Graves said, his voice measured, a quiet force beneath the thunder's growl. "It's over. A brittle laugh broke from her lips, sharp as glass. "Is it?" she murmured, her gaze fixed on the empty hearth as though it held all the answers she sought. "I rather think it's only just begun." Detective Eleanor Wren took a step forward, her keen eyes never leaving Evelyn's rigid form. "You've spent far too long running from this, my dear," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "It must be exhausting." Evelyn's shoulders twitched, a shiver running through her frame, though whether it was from the cold or the weight of truth pressing against her, no one could say. She inhaled sharply. "I don't know what you mean." Eleanor tilted her head, studying her. "Oh, but you do." The silence stretched between them thick and suffocating. Lightning flashed outside, and for the briefest moment, Evelyn's reflection shimmered in the window pane, a ghostly figure trapped between past and present. Jonathan sighed. "We know you were at the gallery the night Oliver Fairfax was murdered. You claimed you left before the storm worsened. But the evidence tells another story, doesn't it?" Evelyn flinched, her grip tightening on the mantel. "I told you the truth." "And yet," Eleanor interjected, her voice a whisper of steel, "your words have always carried the weight of something unsaid." A long, ragged breath escaped Evelyn's lips. "What is it you think I left unsaid?" Eleanor took another step, her presence unshakable. "Perhaps the part where you realized Oliver never truly loved you." The fire crackled, sending a flicker of light across Evelyn's pale face, exposing the anguish carved into its delicate lines. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, a distant pain tightening her expression. "I gave him everything," she whispered, the confession slipping free as if it had been waiting all along. "I believed in him, supported his work when no one else would." Eleanor nodded, her gaze unwavering. "But admiration is not love." A harsh, broken sound escaped Evelyn's lips, a laugh or a sob, neither entirely whole. "No," she admitted, her voice raw. "It is not." She turned then, her eyes glassy, haunted. "I thought if I waited long enough, if I proved my worth, he would see me, choose me." Her voice cracked, unraveling into something helpless and undone. "But he never did. And then I found out about her." A shudder passed through her, her breath hitching. "He said it was nothing, that it didn't matter." A bitter smile twisted her lips. "But I knew." The way he spoke about her, the way he painted her. Jonathan exhaled slowly. "And in your grief, your anger, you struck him." Evelyn's face crumpled, her knees nearly giving way before she caught herself on the chair beside her. "I didn't mean to," she gasped. I just wanted him to feel it, to see me for once." But he fell, hit his head. She choked on a sob, hands clenching in her lap. "I never meant to kill him." A heavy silence settled over the room, but Eleanor did not look triumphant. Her gaze remained steady, patient. "Then tell me, Evelyn," she said, gently, "if you didn't mean to kill Oliver, why did someone else try to silence Arthur Calloway?" Evelyn's breath caught. A flicker of terror passed through her eyes. "I don't know what you mean, but she did." Eleanor could see it, the moment realization bloomed, the moment fear took root. Jonathan frowned, glancing between them. "What are you getting at, Wren?" Eleanor turned to him, a slow, knowing smile playing at her lips. "Evelyn killed Oliver Fairfax," she murmured, her eyes gleaming with something darker, sharper. "But I rather think she isn't the only one with blood on her hands." And just like that, the game had changed. The grand hall of Hawthorne Manor was alive with murmurs, the hushed voices of its gathered elite weaving an undercurrent of unease beneath the glittering chandeliers. The annual winter gala had always been an affair of grandeur, a night of shimmering gowns and polished smiles. But tonight, an unseen weight hung in the air, thick as the scent of candle wax and aged wine. In the center of it all, veiled beneath a sheet of black silk, stood the final work of Sebastian Vance, the renowned artist whose tragic death had sent ripples of scandal through the city's aristocracy. His masterpiece, shrouded in secrecy even before his passing, was to be unveiled this very night. And yet, beneath the golden grandeur, there lurked a shadow that no one dared name. At the far end of the room, Evelyn Marchmont stood by the great fireplace, its heat doing little to thaw the ice in her veins. Her fingers curled subtly against the edge of her satin gloves, though her expression remained impassive, carefully composed. She had been waiting for this night, dreading it, anticipating it with a feverish sort of desperation. It was over. It had to be. And yet, Miss Marchmont, came the smooth, familiar voice. Evelyn tensed, just slightly, before turning to face Jonathan Carlyle, his sharp eyes gleaming with the quiet amusement of a man who knew far too much. "You seem rather preoccupied this evening." Evelyn managed a brittle smile. "Mere anticipation, Mr. Carlyle. Surely you understand the gravity of such an event." Carlyle studied her for a moment before nodding. "Indeed, though I must say, I've been rather preoccupied myself. The circumstances of Vance's death, quite tragic, wouldn't you agree?" Evelyn's stomach knotted, but she held her gaze steady. A dreadful accident. A flicker of something knowing passed across Carlyle's face. "Accident," he echoed. "Yes, that is the official conclusion, isn't it?" Before Evelyn could respond, the room hushed as Lady Whitmore stepped onto the small stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she declared, her voice ringing through the hall, "it is my honor to present the final work of Sebastian Vance." With a single motion the black silk was pulled away. The collective gasp that followed sent a shiver through Evelyn's spine. There upon the vast canvas was not the triumphant masterpiece of an artist at the height of his career, but something far darker, twisted strokes of crimson and shadow, a portrait not of beauty, but of grief. And at its center, a woman. Her features were unmistakable. Evelyn, her face frozen in anguish, her eyes dark wells of despair, her figure trapped in jagged lines that screamed of betrayal. A slow, suffocating silence settled over the room. Then a single voice, quiet but cutting. My, Carlyle, murmured, his breath warm against Evelyn's ear. It seems Sebastian had a great deal to say before he died. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face, her carefully constructed world teetering at the edge of ruin, and somewhere beyond the gleaming ballroom, in the quiet corridors of Hawthorne Manor, a figure watched from the shadows, silent, patient, waiting, because this wasn't over, not yet. The town of Blackwood Hollow was returning to its familiar quiet, its cobblestone streets and ivy-covered cottages settling back into routine. The autumn gala had concluded, its banners taken down, the last murmurs of scandal fading into whispers, yet for Evelyn Harrow, the night was far from over. She sat by the crackling fire in her dimly lit study, the scent of aged parchment and candle wax thick in the air. Outside the wind howled through the ancient trees, rattling the window panes like the echoes of secrets long buried. Evelyn's fingers traced the edge of a folded letter, the final correspondence from the late Victor Bellamy, the celebrated artist whose work had captivated Blackwood Hollow for decades. His sudden and violent death had left the town shaken, the gala tainted by whispers of betrayal and deception. His final painting, unveiled beneath the great chandeliers of Holloway Manor, had been meant as a triumph. Instead it had become a confession, a portrait unlike any other, its dark hues and jagged strokes revealing a truth more sinister than anyone had anticipated. At its center, a lone figure, a woman frozen in anguish, her eyes haunted, her face eerily familiar. Evelyn had recognized her at once. Footsteps on the gravel path outside made her stiffen. She placed the letter into the depths of her desk drawer, her mind racing. Someone had been watching her since the night of the unveiling. Someone who knew that Victor Bellamy's death had not been the act of a desperate thief or a random tragedy, but something far more calculated. A quiet knock echoed through the room. Evelyn exhaled, steadying herself before crossing the room to open the door. There, standing against the cold, was Oliver Graves, the town's most enigmatic investigator. His presence was an answer to a question she had not dared ask aloud. "Miss Harrow," he said, his voice smooth, measured, "I believe it's time we spoke about Victor Bellamy's last painting." Evelyn studied him, her grip tightening on the doorframe. "It was only a painting, Mr. Graves." A slow, knowing smile crossed his lips. "No, Miss Harrow," it was a warning. Beyond the dim glow of the lanterns, Blackwood Hollow slumbered, unaware that its darkest secrets were about to be unearthed.